Well, Dave, we know how this event is chiefly remembered. The end of Goldberg's streak as Kevin Nash sees fit after Scott Hall tases Goldberg to jackknife him straight to hell. Get that 1, 2, 3. Before we get to how the finish of Starrcade 98 came together and your thoughts and remembrances of it, first on the streak, what's the lesson here in how Goldberg got over?
The lesson is that right place, right time, right luck. And by the time people started trying to cut him off, he was had already taken off, and the people in charge kind of thought of him as their idea. So once you got that, it's like our great idea. You're going to go with your great idea. So yeah, like I said, this was not a master plan. It was just something that happened, and it got really, really big in a hurry.
So there was never a point where they said, it just happened that he had won so many matches in a row, and then someone points it out, and we're off to the races. There's a lot of different origin stories on this thing, so I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah, the streak. I can tell you how the streak come up. It was Mike Tenay, because I know it because I was on the phone with him, and he called me up and he just goes, "I got this idea. It's the streak." And then it was like, we want, and his thing was, we've got to find out how many straight matches he's won. So we went back and looked through, and whatever it was I think maybe in the 30s or something. But it was, we looked back at the results for the legitimate number, and then he came on TV the next week with the legitimate number, and then every week, like I said, the number was legitimate, and people knew, you had these fans who they would know how many house shows he worked during the week, and they would come in with a number and all that, and it was they made it legit, they made it real because it was a real number, and as soon as they made it fake, it became fake pro wrestling, and that's when they killed it. And I knew the minute when they started doing the fake number on the streak, I knew people would resent it because now you're lying to them, and they didn't understand that aspect at all. That was going to kill the streak because, but it did, and by the end, I mean there is a correct thing that Bill was starting to get resentment, but that was because now he was being. Now the whole thing had become fake, and now it was like this guy beating everybody really quick, and they ruined what they had.
Georgia Dome, July 98, ahead of Starrcade. Goldberg pins Hogan clean to become the champion. Perfect finish. Great anointing of Goldberg. Great rocket up the rear end as if he wasn't already the biggest star in WCW at the time. Looking back on that, how did that coalesce so quickly that Goldberg goes from the Goldberg we talked about at Starrcade 97, just kind of feeling his way around in the dark, getting the hang of this thing, to a guy that even Hulk Hogan couldn't scoff at doing the job for, and in fact, sort of volunteered to do the job for?
Hogan suggested it, because the whole thing was they had this, they had this show at the Georgia Dome, and they had a record advance, and that was just because the company was hot. And Bill was a big part of it. Bill was the top babyface at the time. So Hogan came up with the idea of doing a dark match, Hogan and Bill Goldberg, with the idea that, and non-title, Bill go over, because they didn't want to stop the streak. Hogan knew that wasn't a good idea. So they were going to do the non-title match with the idea that all the Turner execs would be there, and they would see, 35, 40,000 people in the building, and they would see Hulk Hogan and Bill Goldberg in the main event, and Hogan knew that everybody would look at it, even though those tickets had already been sold even before the match was announced. And they would look and go, man, Hulk Hogan, Bill Goldberg, those guys are superstars. That's the biggest thing we've ever had, and it's great brownie points. And then when the tickets kept moving, Hogan decided, might as well do it on TV and might as well do the title change because it's probably going to draw record rating. And I think it did. I believe it was the highest rated quarter hour that they'd done probably since the Flair Sting match in 88, which is, 10 years earlier. So he guessed correctly there. He did the right thing for Goldberg. The problem was that then when you had the next couple of, pay-per-views, Hogan's match got all the push, and Goldberg's match, which wasn't with Hogan, got the second push because the big thing was that they should have done a Hogan-Goldberg series with Goldberg winning again, but Hogan wasn't going to do the second one. And that was an issue. So Goldberg's out there working with whoever, the Giant and some other people. But now it's like he's gone from Hulk Hogan to secondary guys, and Hulk Hogan's still on top. and because of that, it just I don't know, it kind of and of course the other part was WWF was really catching fire with
Yeah.
Austin. That also didn't help matters, and WCW was self-destructing because I think the pressure of how WWF was doing because of Austin and beating them was driving everybody crazy, and I think that they just kind of lost their minds at the same time.
Well, you can see how, here's an example of that. I can see, I'm being sarcastic here, why Goldberg didn't belong in the main event, because we simply had to make allowance for Jay Leno, for example. We had to make room for Karl Malone. And
well, that's when they really got desperate. Now, the Malone, okay, I will say this. I
yeah,
thought the Malone,
success.
The Malone thing was a big success.
I agree.
Okay, the problem is then they came back with Leno. And it's like, when you do that celebrity thing, you really need to not go back to it for about a year, and maybe even longer. They went right back to another one. And also, Jay Leno was an athlete. Karl Malone was an athlete.
Yeah.
Dennis Rodman was an athlete. And they were big guys. Jay Leno was, that was too much of a joke. And it didn't draw the way it should have. It didn't draw nearly what I thought. And I thought the dynamic was all wrong anyway.
And all the while, Goldberg is being eclipsed, too. That's happening as well as a kind of a consequence of this.
Because of all the publicity's on Hogan again.
Yep. Was there a feeling going into Starrcade 98 that night? First of all, sitting down to watch that show that evening, did you know Nash was going over?
Yes, I did. And I was really not happy with it. And I think most people in the company weren't happy with it. But, he'd convinced people that they had to end the streak and that he was the only guy believable enough to end it with. I didn't know how the finish would go, with the taser and all that, which actually I thought made it only worse.
Yeah.
But, I didn't. I knew that there were people fighting it, but I didn't think that they had the power. And Bill, Bill didn't really understand. Bill was just a guy going through. I mean, he didn't know the business well enough to know how he got there. He just got there. And I don't think I think he does now, but I don't think he realized then all the sharks that were, trying to cut him off and make sure that he didn't become the new Hulk Hogan, which, he could have been. I mean, like the new big star. And he didn't even have to talk. I mean, that was one of the things is, well, his work wasn't that good. And it's like, you know what? Hogan's work was never that good when he was drawing his biggest money. And Hogan was a good promo, but Bob Backlund was never a good promo. Really when he was drawn, it's like if you're over, you're over. And he was over. And, he was over in spite of his weaknesses. And everyone's got weaknesses. But people are like really focusing on Bill's weaknesses as an excuse to, deny what he'd already passed. He already was over. You can't, to say, well, because of this he can't get over. Yeah, he already is over. So you just can't say that. Oh, he can't stay over because of this. Well, when he stops being over, we'll say why he can't stay over. And maybe in 18 months people would get bored with it, and maybe they never would. We'll never know.
We won't. I got to know. I mean, to the degree that you are familiar with this, I'd love if you could share. How does Kevin Nash possibly concoct an argument that the streak has to end? Why? No, it doesn't.
I don't think that was necessarily just Kevin Nash, because I heard a lot of people going, well, now we have to end the streak.
Why?
Because they felt creatively stifled, that what can we do creatively if we can't beat him? And the problem is that when it's working, you don't necessarily have to be creative. When it stops working, then start thinking about what to do next. But don't rush it. But I think their feeling was we got to beat him. But even then, the whole thing of, and this is another reason why I was so negative on the beating him, was because it was just this thing for like about the last 2 months or so, maybe 6 weeks, whatever it was. We have to beat him. We have to beat him. And I'm thinking, why do you have to beat him? And then what are you going to do after you beat him? And there was no thought of what are we going to do after we beat him. It was just a thing of, well, the streak's gone as far as it can go. We have to beat him. And it's like, but you didn't know any follow-up. And I mean, I remember the story of, again, which was Mike Tenay and Bobby Heenan and Tony Schiavone after the show in D.C. And when Nash won, and they're going, that's it. It's over. It's over. We're on the way down. And Tony Schiavone's like, you guys don't know anything. And it's like, Bobby Heenan had, he had the instinct, and Tenay knew wrestling better than anyone there. And it was just like, and I mean, I didn't know they were going to go down as quick as they did, but they were on the way down. I mean, Bill Goldberg was propping them up. I think they pretty much would have been on the way down after the Sting match, like I said, if it wasn't for Bill Goldberg. But when they did that, it was like, okay, now what do you do? And then pretty soon we had, Jeff Jarrett and Booker T and these type of guys on top. And nothing against them, but they weren't over like Bill Goldberg was over. And Bill, they once he lost, once they didn't know what to do with him, and then you had guys not wanting to lose to him. Hogan never lost the second time to him. I don't remember if Nash ever lost to him, but that I don't remember like a big Goldberg Nash rematch that was that where Goldberg got his revenge, and they did that follow up thing where they were going to do the Goldberg Nash match on the Nitro the next week. And then they did that whole thing with Elizabeth, which I thought was that was a really bad television show, and that really hurt a lot because it just made him, like when that show was over, it's like he's just another goof in the circus, and that's exactly what they didn't need at that point in time was another goof in the circus.
Now Nash comes into this match, NWO Wolfpack. They had decided in '98, as opposed to do away with or wind down the NWO, to just branch it off. And if Nash is going to turn on Hogan, it's going to be as a representative of a subset or a splinter group of the NWO, as opposed to, joining the WCW cause. And what did that tell you when they went with the Wolfpack idea? To me, I remember feeling like these guys can't move on from the NWO. That's what this is.
Well, I think that it was the Wolfpack idea was the idea that the NWO is weighing us all down, and we don't want to be associated with these other guys, so we're going to create our own new NWO. But it was, we can't get away from the factions. We know no other way. We have to have an NWO. So now we're going to try to resurrect the old NWO by doing by eliminating or staying away from the black and white NWO, which we didn't really want anyway, which wanted to promote the concept of the NWO down. So it was just, and by this point, it was time to move on from the NWO.
Now, Ric Flair makes a great comeback. September 15th, 1998. Returns to Nitro, the Four Horsemen reformed. He cuts one of the promos of his life on Eric Bischoff, and that ultimately builds to Flair versus Bischoff at Starrcade 98 for the WCW presidency. There's a backstory here, of course, that led to Flair being so impassioned on the stick that night, and it was pretty well known in wrestling, the behind-the-scenes tension that had gone on between Bischoff and Flair to prompt that level of frustration. If you could just paint a quick picture for us, Dave, of what was buttressing that passion in Flair's voice that night, and what was the problem with he and Bischoff that led to such a hot angle?
Well, there was always problems because Flair was there, and he was always kind of shoved aside. And so I think there was always going to be that frustration. And then there was an amateur wrestling tournament, and Rick said he asked for the day off, which was a television taping, and there was a Thunder show. And his son Reed was in some big tournament, and he wanted to go see it, and so he went. And they said that he no-showed. And guys were no-showing left and right in that era. I mean, it's like, when you talk about, like, guys, like if you say, like, this guy wouldn't do a job, like today, let's just say, which doesn't happen. You don't have people going, I'm not doing jobs like you did, in that era. But when in that era, guys would say, hey, I don't feel like doing jobs. And if Hogan backed you up, I mean, I'll just give you an example of how ridiculous it was. There was a match booked on television once, and it was the Giant, Paul White, against Bryan Adams. And the Giant was supposed to go over with a choke slam. And Bryan Adams, who's Bryan Adams, right? He went to Hogan and goes,
Yep.
Do I really have to do it? And Hogan goes, they made a DQ finish. Like that's how bad it was. I mean, when you had Bryan Adams getting away with not doing the job, let alone Kevin Nash doing whatever he wanted, or whatever. Yeah. Ric Flair would do the jobs, which whatever. I mean, but anyway, so Rick no-showed or sent in word that whatever it was. I mean, I knew he wasn't going, so they had to know. But whatever it was, they sued him for breach of contract, and Eric gave a big speech in the locker room, which was a real negative speech. It was actually before this, where and a lot of people took it badly because Eric gave a speech, and I forgot the exact wording, but I think it was like the only guys in this room who've ever really drawn money were, I believe it was Hulk Hogan
and Piper,
Roddy Piper, and Randy Savage.
Yeah.
I think, and Nash and Hall, I don't think were in that list. So I'm sure they were thrilled. And Flair, but everyone took it as the insult to Flair because Flair had been such a big draw for much of his career and had built the Carolinas and everything like that. So it was taken as a big insult to Flair, that speech. So there was that problem. I think because it's funny because obviously today Flair and Bischoff were buddies, but it's I think that there was a feeling of that Flair represented what WCW was before, and Bischoff maybe thought that we have to move away from. So therefore, Flair kind of got the short end of a lot of things. But anyway, he was being sued, so he was out of action. The lawsuit was there, and then they settled out of court, brought back Flair, and so Flair basically called on everything that had gone down, and yeah, he cut that crazy promo when they returned the Four Horsemen. It was huge. But then they didn't follow that up well either.
Yeah.